Hello, everyone. I hope you guys, whoever is on, can you please let me know if the sound is okay? I haven't been on my computer in a minute. Hope everybody is doing well and had a nice break. Okay, it's been a few days. Um, Thanks to the holidays, since anyone has been able to do the walking through the Bible with you all. Not sure who's on, but if you could please let me know in the chat if the sound is okay. Let me make sure the chat is on. Okay, well, I don't see anybody on now. Whoever was on logged off. So I'm going to just jump in and hopefully the sound is on. I don't see the little mic thing moving here. All right, y'all will let me know if y'all can't hear me, but I hope everybody had a great Thanksgiving holiday. Listen, if anybody, good evening, Piccolo. Um, God bless you. Thank you for tuning in. I guess that means that you could hear me. Pastor Frankie, God bless you. Great message. Okay, thank you so much for letting me know that you can hear. I'm going to just give a quick little background since it's been a little bit since we've been on. Pastor Frankie blessed us when he did his teaching, his last walking through the Bible. And so, good evening, Latifa. I love you, girl. So we're gonna continue on basically where Pastor Frankie left off, and in Jeremiah 49 is basically just talking about more judgments right from God. So quick background, since it's been a little bit, and we'll be closing up the book of Jeremiah today. So some background on it is basically this book was to make clear, right, to Israel the consequences of sin and apostasy. All right, to reveal to Jerusalem and Judah, right, to reveal to them their own future in the plan of God for man, to emphasize that the destiny of every man is determined by his conformity or lack of conformity to God and his plan. So that's the background on the entire book of Jeremiah. And then the theme of the book is basically, Jeremiah was a prophet, so there are some prophetic things in there, some that happened during his time, some that happened after his time. But it's basically a book on backsliding and the dangers of apostasy. And hold on, just hang with me. I know some of y'all might be like, hey, what is that? But Jeremiah was the first one, right, to have continuous open warfare with his people. And so, for those of you that may not know what apostasy means, is basically the abandonment or renunciation of a religious belief. So, if you've been following along up until this point, we know that um, uh, Judah and Jerusalem, Israel were split. And so they had times where they had kings that were for God, and then they had times where they had kings that were just kings that upset God because they had idols in the land, and just doing all kinds of ungodly, unbiblical things. And so starting off with chapter 49 again is God's judgments to surrounding nations, right? And Jeremiah is basically communicating God's feelings. And so chapter 49 starts off with the judgment of the nations that surround Judah, right? The restoration. Jeremiah also talks about the restoration that will be accompanied um, by the judgment and of those who have caused Judah troubles, right? And also showing how the God of justice operates in history. So 49 talks about judgment against Ammon, Edom, Damascus, Kedar and Hazar, and Elam. I'm not going to go into those just because time, right? And also they were very self-explanatory. Jeremiah, a lot of the things he wrote were prophetic, were poems. I'm sorry. His prophecies were prophetic, poetic. I can't even talk today. His writings were poetic in nature, so it's very easy to understand in chapter 49 for the most part, because it's just basically him going over, what God is about to do to these nations that were just troublesome to Judah. And so jumping into chapter 50, Apostle, good evening. Jasmine, good evening. I'm going to write back to you, Jasmine. Thank you for sending that. Apostle, Pastor, y'all, love y'all. And so chapter 50, another one is starting off with prophecy against Babylon. And so the judgment on Babylon and the Babylonians, meaning the Chaldeans. And one key part in chapter 50 was verse 4, where Jeremiah begins to speak about unity. God puts it on his heart to speak about coming unity between Judah and Israel and their eventual coming together, because we know up until this point they had been split between north and south. So he does begin to talk about that in chapter 50. But again, it's another chapter of judgment, right, against Babylon and their treatment towards Israel and Judah. And so some verses in 50, right, verses 50 and 6, you know, just how both Judah and Israel are called my people. Okay, so not one of them is cast off any more than another. All right, and then verse 7 talking about uh in chapter 50, the nations who were used as instruments to chasten Israel were actually commissioned by God, right? And the reason being is because the reason why judgment came upon them, although God used some of these other nations to try to get Judah back into alignment, the reason why God wind up imposing judgment on them is because they overstepped their boundaries. So, if God gave them instructions to do one thing, they would go off and do something, totally off. And so that's why they impose judgment on themselves in the end of it all. And then there were two reasons in chapter 50, verse 11, why God punished the Chaldeans, because they were glad when Israel was destroyed. All right. And we know that Israel was just a nation that had a covenant with God. And because they were also proud, right? And they grew fat, lazy, and they just, again, basically weren't doing what God had even asked them to do, or what he even called them to do. And so chapter 51 talks about utter destruction of Babylon again, right? Babylon judged by the Lord for sins against Israel, and for, him saying that Israel is not forsaken and neither was Judah. So even though they were split, God looked at them as one. And verse 6, right, time of the Lord's vengeance to recompense Israel. Verse 7 in chapter 51 talks about Babylon was a golden cup in God's hand. So again, that's showing how God's intention even toward Babylon was good, but then we know King Nebuchadnezzar was just rotten to the core, and he was idolatrous in his own right. He erected his own statue, and so that kind of stuff angered the Lord. And chapter 15, verse 15 in chapter 51 talks about the sevenfold greatness of God. And so I want to kind of go over that. I like chapter 51 because it does talk about how great God is in the midst of all the stuff that we do as humans, or even in the midst of stuff as they did. Good evening, Pastor Tamika. God bless you. And so the sevenfold greatness of God, he was made the earth. He made the earth by his power. He has established the world by his wisdom. He was stretched out. He stretched out the heavens. Let me move this over here. He stretched out the heavens. And so, Jeremiah is saying, hey, kind of trying to give them a warning, like, all this stuff, you guys are doing all this stuff, not remembering God's goodness, all the things that he has done for you and brought you through. And then what I like about Jeremiah 51 as well is there's a verse in there that we, if you're any kind of prayer warrior, that's one that you may know. and it's down in verse 20. So Jeremiah 51 and 20, where a lot of people like to pray, "You are my battle axe and weapon of war. For with you I will break the nation in pieces, and with you I will destroy kingdoms." And the Lord was talking about King Cyrus, that he would use him for his glory. And so it's talking about 10 things Cyrus was to break for God: the nations, kingdoms, the horse and the rider, the chariot and the rider, the man and woman, the old, the young, the young man and the maiden, were just some of the things that the Lord was going to use King Cyrus for in that time. And then verse 19, going back, verse 19, God addresses the idols in the land, which is part of what brought Babylon to destruction, right? And then God speaks of how useless idols are. And reason why I want to key into that part, how useless idols are, is that nowadays we have believers that are tapping into new age stuff. And remember, this is walking through the Bible, so we're trying to show what these scriptures mean, but also give you a little bit about how they apply to us today. Because some people may say, oh, the Old Testament, I don't need to read that. It doesn't really apply to us today, because of what Jesus did on the cross. But God still had it that where he put all these 66 books together so that it can be a blueprint for us. And so when you're looking at this kind of stuff, if you're reading the Bible like we're supposed to be every day, because it's meant to renew our minds, right? So when you look at this, and in chapter Jeremiah 51, when it talks about how useless idols are, God shows how, these are just images, these are just statues that have no life. But Jesus had, he's spirit, he's life. He was a man that, he became flesh. And so he was God's son, God's spirit that became flesh, God that became flesh in the earth. And so he's showing us in here that if you're one, we get caught up in new agey stuff, meaning trying to mix Christianity with serving other gods, with like Buddha, and getting into yoga and all kinds of other things that were made for these deities, these are idols that the Bible talks about, that you see so much mixture now today in the church. But you can tell that the mixture is there because you have people that don't really get in the word and let the word renew them, let the word encourage them, let the word even teach them. So I love this in chapter 51 because it talks about idols and how they're useless, and they don't have life, they don't perform miracles, they don't do what Jesus has done, right? They don't do what God can do, they don't do what the Holy Spirit can do. And so moving forward, getting through chapter 51, and then so again, more just judgment. Finishing off with chapter 52, it's talking about the fall of Jerusalem is reviewed, and basically how King Zedekiah took over. Um, and he was the king of Jerusalem in that time, and he did evil things in the sight of the Lord. And so the Lord cast Jerusalem and Judah out from his presence. Zedekiah rebels against the king of Babylon, and okay, not only did he do things that was evil in the sight of the Lord, but he was off. Like he was like, I'm not gonna do what God said, but I'm gonna even come against Nebuchadnezzar, who was mighty in the land at that time. He was like his kingdom, Babylon, was the kingdom that everybody feared. And so Zedekiah rebels against the king of Babylon. The Chaldeans take over, they overtake Zedekiah and his army. His army scatters, okay? And so the king of Babylon then kills all this is so gangster. Like if you don't read the Bible, like you should, because it's actually entertaining. So the king of Babylon, which was Nebuchadnezzar, when Zedekiah is captured, because remember he rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, he's captured. The king of Babylon then kills all of Zedekiah's sons right in front of him. So remember, rebellion. Remember, we talked about the theme of Jeremiah is when you get into apostasy, right? You abandon your faith. time and time again, we see how people abandon God. They abandon God for idols. These people were doing things that was evil in the sight of the Lord. So this is what Zedekiah was doing. Remember, you reap what you sow. So his kids were killed in front of him. All of his sons were killed in front of him. Then the king of Babylon took out Zedekiah's eyes, bound him in chains. This is all chapter 52, and I'm almost done. Bound him in chains and put him in prison until he died. Okay. Then Nebuchadnezzar's right-hand man goes and burns down the house of the Lord's kings, right? Zedekiah, he burns down Zedekiah's house and all of the homes of all the great men in Jerusalem. So Nebuchadnezzar's right-hand man, his name was Nebuzaradan, something like that. It's almost like Nebuchadnezzar's name. He was the right hand. He burned down the king's house of Jerusalem, and then all the great men of Jerusalem, he burned down their houses. Okay. And then the Chaldeans took items from the house of the Lord for themselves. Okay. The right-hand man, the captain of the guard, right? Nebuchadnezzar's right-hand man, took the chief priest of Jerusalem and other key men from Jerusalem to Babylon, where they were put to death. And then from there, the Babylonians began to take Jews captive each year, totaling 4,600 Jews. So for a few years, they continued going back and taking the Jews captive. So again, obviously, this kind of stuff, we know the Lord has a love for Judah, Israel, Jerusalem, and a love for the Jews. So obviously he got upset about this, which later leads to the unity of it all. But that was the end of the book of Jeremiah. So I hope you guys had a great holiday week. Thank you all for tuning in tonight. All of y'all that came in on this Sunday evening. We'll be back on track tomorrow, where Teacher Liz will be going over Lamentations for us. And keep tuning in, walking through the Bible as the year is coming to a close. I love you all. Have a blessed Sunday evening, a great week, and y'all take care.